Chapter 26 of 2000 Leagues Under the Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Thomas Kuzmarski. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Translated by F.P. Walter. Chapter 2. A new proposition from Captain Nemo. On January 28th, in latitude 9 degrees 4 minutes north, when the Nautilus returned at noon to the surface of the sea, it lay in sight of land some 8 miles to the west. Right off, I observed a cluster of mountains about 2,000 feet high, whose shapes were very whimsically sculpted. After our position fix, I re-entered the lounge, and when our bearings were reported on the chart, I saw that we were off the island of Ceylon, that pearl dangling from the lower lobe of the Indian Peninsula. I went looking in the library for a book about this island, one of the most fertile in the world. Sure enough, I found a volume entitled Ceylon and the Singhalese by H.C. Sir, re-entering the lounge. I first noted the bearings of Ceylon, on which antiquity lavished so many different names. It was located between latitude 5 degrees 55 minutes and 9 degrees 49 minutes north, and between longitude 79 degrees 42 minutes and 82 degrees 4 minutes east of the meridian of Greenwich. Its length is 275 miles, its maximum width 150 miles, its circumference 900 miles. Its surface area, 24,448 square miles. In other words, a little smaller than that of Ireland. Just then, Captain Nemo and his chief officer appeared. The captain glanced at the chart. Then, turning to me, "The island of Ceylon," he said, "is famous for its pearl fisheries. Would you be interested, Professor Aronnax, in visiting one of those fisheries?" "Certainly, Captain." "Fine. It's easily done. Only when we see the fisheries, we'll see no fishermen. The annual harvest hasn't yet begun. No matter, I'll give orders to make for the Gulf of Mannar, and we'll arrive there late tonight." The captain said a few words to his chief officer, who went out immediately. Soon the Nautilus re-entered its liquid element, and the pressure gauge indicated that it was staying at a depth of 30 feet. With the chart under my eyes, I looked for the Gulf of Mannar. I found it by the 9th parallel off the northwestern shores of Ceylon. It was formed by the long curve of Little Mannar Island. To reach it, we had to go all the way up Ceylon's west coast. "Professor," Captain Nemo then told me, "there are pearl fisheries in the Bay of Bengal, the seas of the East Indies, the seas of China and Japan, plus those seas south of the United States, the Gulf of Panama, and the Gulf of California. But it's off Ceylon that such fishing reaps its richest rewards. No doubt we'll be arriving a little early. Fishermen gather in the Gulf of Mannar only during the month of March, and for 30 days some 300 boats concentrate on the lucrative harvest of these treasures from the sea. Each boat is manned by 10 oarsmen and 10 fishermen. The latter divide into 2 groups, dive in rotation, and descend to a depth of 12 meters with the help of a heavy stone clutched between their feet and attached by a rope to their boat. "You mean," I said, "that such primitive methods are still all that they use?" "All," Captain Nemo answered me, "although these fisheries belong to the most industrialized people in the world, the English, to whom the Treaty of Amiens granted them in 1802. It strikes me that diving suits like yours could perform yeoman service in such work." "Yes, since those poor fishermen can't stay long underwater." On his voyage to Ceylon, the Englishman Percival made much of a Kaffir who stayed under 5 minutes without coming up to the surface, but I find that hard to believe. I know that some divers can last up to 57 seconds, and highly skillful ones to 87, but such men are rare, and when the poor fellows climb back on board, the water coming out of their noses and ears is tinted with blood. I believe the average time underwater that these fishermen can tolerate is 30 seconds, during which they hastily stuff their little nets with all the pearl oysters they can tear loose. But these fishermen generally don't live to advanced age. Their vision weakens, ulcers break out on their eyes, sores form on their bodies, and some are even stricken with apoplexy on the ocean floor. "Yes," I said, "it's a sad occupation, and one that exists only to gratify the whims of fashion. But tell me, Captain, how many oysters can a boat fish up in a workday?" "About 40,000 to 50,000. It's even said that in 1814, when the English government went fishing on its own behalf, its divers worked just 20 days and brought up 76 million oysters." "At least," I asked, "the fishermen are well paid, aren't they?" "Hardly, professor. In Panama, they make just $1 per week. In most places, they earn only a penny for each oyster that has a pearl, and they bring up so many that have none." "Only 1 penny to those poor people who make their employers rich? That's atrocious." "On that note, professor," Captain Nemo told me, "you and your companions will visit the Mannar oyster bank, and if by chance some eager fisherman arrives early, well, we can watch him at work." "That suits me, Captain. By the way, Professor Aronnax, you aren't afraid of sharks, are you?" "Sharks?" I exclaimed. This struck me as a pretty needless question, to say the least. "Well," Captain Nemo went on, "I admit, Captain, I'm not yet on very familiar terms with that genus of fish." "We're used to them, the rest of us," Captain Nemo answered, "and in time you will be too. Anyhow, we'll be armed, and on our way we might hunt a man-eater or two. It's a fascinating sport. So, professor, I'll see you tomorrow bright and early." This said in a carefree tone, Captain Nemo left the lounge. If you're invited to hunt bears in the Swiss mountains, you might say, "Oh good, I get to go bear hunting tomorrow." If you're invited to hunt lions on the Atlas plains or tigers in the jungles of India, you might say, "Ha! Now's my chance to hunt lions and tigers." But if you're invited to hunt sharks in their native element, you might want to think it over before accepting. As for me, I passed a hand over my brow, where beads of cold sweat were busy forming. Let's think this over, I said to myself, and let's take our time. Hunting otters in underwater forests, as we did in the forests of Crespo Island, is an acceptable activity. But to roam the bottom of the sea when you're almost certain to meet man-eaters in the neighborhood, that's another story. I know that in certain countries, particularly the Andaman Islands, Negroes don't hesitate to attack sharks, dagger in one hand and noose in the other. But I also know that many who face those fearsome animals don't come back alive. Besides, I'm not a Negro, and even if I were a Negro in this instance, I don't think a little hesitation on my part would be out of place. And there I was, fantasizing about sharks, envisioning huge jaws armed with multiple rows of teeth and capable of cutting a man in half. I could already feel a definite pain around my pelvic girdle, and how I resented the offhand manner in which the captain had extended his deplorable invitation. You would have thought it was an issue of going into the woods on some harmless fox hunt. Thank heavens, I said to myself, Conseil will never want to come along, and that'll be my excuse for not going with the captain. As for Ned Land, I admit I felt less confident of his wisdom. Danger, however great, held a perennial attraction for his aggressive nature. I went back to reading Sir's book, but I leafed through it mechanically. Between the lines, I kept seeing fearsome, wide-open jaws. Just then, Conseil and the Canadian entered with a calm, even gleeful air. Little did they know what was waiting for them. "Ye gods, sir," Ned Land told me, "your Captain Nemo, the devil take him, has just made us a very pleasant proposition." "Oh?" I said. "You know about—" "With all due respect to master," Conseil replied, "the Nautilus's commander has invited us, together with master, for a visit tomorrow to Ceylon's magnificent pearl fisheries. He did so in the most cordial terms and conducted himself like a true gentleman." "He didn't tell you anything else?" "Nothing, sir," the Canadian replied. "He said you'd already discussed this little stroll." "Indeed," I said, "but didn't he give you any details on—" "Not a one, Mr. Naturalist. You will be going with us, right?" "Me? Why, yes, certainly, of course." "I can see that you like the idea, Mr. Land." "Yes, it will be a really unusual experience." "And possibly dangerous," I added in an insinuating tone. "Dangerous?" Ned Land replied. "A simple trip to an oyster bank?" Assuredly, Captain Nemo hadn't seen fit to plant the idea of sharks in the minds of my companions. For my part, I stared at them with anxious eyes, as if they were already missing a limb or two. Should I alert them? Yes, surely, but I hardly knew how to go about it. "Would master," Conseil said to me, "give us some background on pearl fishing?" "On the fishing itself?" I asked. "Or on the occupational hazards that—" "On the fishing," the Canadian replied. "Before we tackle the terrain, it helps to be familiar with it." "All right, sit down, my friends, and I'll teach you everything I myself have just been taught by the Englishman H.C. Sir." Ned and Conseil took seats on a couch, and right off the Canadian said to me, "Sir, just what is a pearl exactly?" "My gallant Ned," I replied. For poets, a pearl is a tear from the sea. For Orientals, it's a drop of solidified dew. For the ladies, it's a jewel they can wear on their fingers, necks, and ears that's oblong in shape, glassy in luster, and formed from mother of pearl. For chemists, it's a mixture of calcium phosphate and calcium carbonate with a little gelatin protein. And finally, for naturalists, it's a simple festering secretion from the organ that produces mother of pearl in certain bivalves. Branch mollusca, Conseil said. Class Acephala. Order Testacea. Correct, my scholarly Conseil. Now then, those testacea capable of producing pearls include rainbow abalone, turbo snails, giant clams, and saltwater scallops. Briefly, all those that secrete mother of pearl, in other words, that blue, azure, violet, or white substance lining the insides of their valves. Are mussels included too? The Canadian asked. Yes, the mussels of certain streams in Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Saxony, Bohemia, and France. Good, the Canadian replied. From now on, we'll pay closer attention to 'em. But, I went on, for secreting pearls, the ideal mollusk is the pearl oyster Meleagrina margaritifera, that valuable shellfish. Pearls result simply from mother of pearl solidifying into a globular shape. Either they stick to the oyster shell, or they become embedded in the creature's folds. On the valves, a pearl sticks fast. On the flesh, it lies loose. But its nucleus is always some small, hard object, say a sterile egg or a grain of sand, around which the mother of pearl is deposited in thin, concentric layers over several years in succession. Can one find several pearls in the same oyster? Conseil asked. Yes, my boy, there are some shellfish that turn into real jewel coffers. They even mention one oyster, about which I remain dubious, that supposedly contained at least 150 sharks. 150 sharks! Ned Land yelped. Did I say sharks? I exclaimed hastily. I meant 150 pearls. Sharks wouldn't make sense. Indeed, Conseil said. But will master now tell us how one goes about extracting these pearls? One proceeds in several ways, and often when pearls stick to the valves, fishermen even pull them loose with pliers. But usually the shellfish are spread out on mats made from the esparto grass that covers the beaches. Thus they die in the open air, and by the end of 10 days they've rotted sufficiently. Next, they're immersed in huge tanks of salt water. Then they're opened up and washed. At this point, the sorters begin their twofold task. First, they remove the layers of mother of pearl, which are known in the industry by the names legitimate silver, bastard white, or bastard black, and these are shipped out in cases weighing 125 to 150 kilograms. Then they remove the oyster's meaty tissue, boil it, and finally strain it in order to extract even the smallest pearls. Do the prices of these pearls differ depending on their size? Conseil asked. Not only their size, I replied, but also according to their shape, their water, in other words, their color, and their orient. In other words, that dappled, shimmering glow that makes them so delightful to the eye. The finest pearls are called virgin pearls or paragons. They form in isolation within the mollusk's tissue. They're white, often opaque, but sometimes of opalescent transparency, and usually spherical or pear-shaped. The spherical ones are made into bracelets, the pear-shaped ones into earrings, and since they're the most valuable, they're priced individually. The other pearls that stick to the oyster shells are more erratically shaped and are priced by weight. Finally, classed in the lowest order, the smallest pearls are known by the name seed pearls. They're priced by the measuring cup and are used mainly in the creation of embroidery for church vestments. But it must be a long, hard job sorting out these pearls by size, the Canadian said. No, my friend, that task is performed with 11 strainers or sieves that are received with different numbers of holes. Those pearls staying in the strainers with 20 to 80 holes are in the first order. Those not slipping through the sieves pierced with 100 to 800 holes are in the second order. Finally, those pearls for which one uses strainers pierced with 900 to 1000 holes make up the seed pearls. How ingenious, Conseil said, to reduce dividing and classifying pearls to a mechanical operation. And could master tell us the profits brought in by harvesting these banks of pearl oysters? According to Sir's book, I replied, these Ceylon fisheries are farmed annually for a total profit of 3 million man-eaters. Francs, Conseil rebuked. Yes, francs. 3 million francs, I went on. But I don't think these fisheries bring in the returns they once did. Similarly, the Central American fisheries used to make an annual profit of 4 million francs during the reign of King Charles V, but now they bring in only 2/3 of that amount. All in all, it's estimated that 9 million francs is the current yearly return for the whole pearl harvesting industry. But, Conseil asked, haven't certain famous pearls been quoted at extremely high prices? Yes, my boy. They say Julius Caesar gave Servilia a pearl worth 120,000 francs in our currency. I've even heard stories, the Canadian said, about some lady in ancient times who drank pearls in vinegar. Cleopatra, Conseil shot back. It must have tasted pretty bad, Ned Land added. Abominable, Ned, my friend, Conseil replied. But when a little glass of vinegar is worth 1,500,000 francs, its taste is a small price to pay. I'm sorry I didn't marry the gal, the Canadian said, throwing up his hands with an air of discouragement. Ned Land married to Cleopatra? Conseil exclaimed. But I was all set to tie the knot, Conseil, the Canadian replied in all seriousness. And it wasn't my fault the whole business fell through. I even bought a pearl necklace for my fiancée, Kate Tender, but she married somebody else instead. Well, that necklace cost me only $1.50. But you can absolutely trust me on this, Professor. Its pearls were so big they wouldn't have gone through that strainer with 20 holes. My gallant Ned, I replied, laughing, those were artificial pearls, ordinary glass beads whose insides were coated with essence of Orient. Wow, the Canadian replied. That essence of Orient must sell for quite a large sum. As little as zero. It comes from the scales of a European carp. It's nothing more than a silver substance that collects in the water and is preserved in ammonia. It's worthless. Maybe that's why Kate Tender married somebody else, replied Mr. Land philosophically. But, I said, getting back to the pearls of great value, I don't think any sovereign ever possessed one superior to the pearl owned by Captain Nemo. This one, Conseil said, pointing to a magnificent jewel in its glass case. Exactly. And I'm certainly not far off when I estimate its value at 2 million francs, Conseil said quickly. Yes, I said, 2 million francs. And no doubt all it cost our captain was the effort to pick it up. Ha! Ned Land exclaimed. During our stroll tomorrow, who says we won't run into one just like it? Bah! Conseil put in. And why not? What good would a pearl worth millions do us here on the Nautilus? Here, no, Ned Land said, but elsewhere... Oh, elsewhere, Conseil put in, shaking his head. In fact, I said, Mr. Land is right. And if we ever brought back to Europe or America a pearl worth millions, it would make the story of our adventures more authentic and much more rewarding. That's how I see it, the Canadian said. But, said Conseil, who perpetually returned to the didactic side of things, is this pearl fishing ever dangerous? No, I replied quickly, especially if one takes certain precautions. What risks would you run in a job like that? Ned Land said, swallowing a few gulps of salt water. Whatever you say, Ned. Then, trying to imitate Captain Nemo's carefree tone, I asked, by the way, gallant Ned, are you afraid of sharks? Me? The Canadian replied. I'm a professional harpooner. It's my job to make a mockery of them. It isn't an issue, I said, of fishing for them with a swivel hook, hoisting them onto the deck of a ship, chopping off the tail with the sweep of an axe, opening the belly, ripping out the heart, and tossing it into the sea. So it's an issue of... Yes, precisely. In the water? In the water. Gods, just give me a harpoon! You see, sir, these sharks are badly designed. They have to roll their bellies over to snap you up. And in the meantime, Ned Land had a way of pronouncing the word snap that sent chills down the spine. Well, how about you, Conseil? What are your feelings about these man-eaters? Me? Conseil said. I'm afraid I must be frank with master. Good for you, I thought. If master faces these sharks, Conseil said, I think his loyal manservant should face them with him. End of section 26. Recording by John Thomas Kuzmorski. www.validateyourlife.com
Chapter 27 of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by ReadWriteLib. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Translated by F.P. Walter. A pearl worth 10 million. Night fell. I went to bed. I slept pretty poorly. Man-eaters played a major role in my dreams. and I found it more or less appropriate that the French word for shark, requin, has its linguistic roots in the word requiem. The next day, at 4 o'clock in the morning, I was awakened by the steward whom Captain Nemo had placed expressly at my service. I got up quickly, dressed, and went into the lounge. Captain Nemo was waiting for me. "Professor Aronnax," he said to me, "are you ready to start?" "I'm ready." "Kindly follow me." "What about my companions, Captain?" "They've been alerted and are waiting for us." "Aren't we going to put on our diving suits?" I asked. "Not yet. I haven't let the Nautilus pull too near the coast, and we're fairly well out from Mannar Oysterbank. But I have the skiff ready, and it will take us to the exact spot where we'll disembark, which will save us a pretty long trek. It's carrying our diving equipment, and we'll suit up just before we begin our water exploring." Captain Nemo took me to the central companionway, whose steps led to the platform. Ned and Conseil were there, enraptured with our pleasure trip getting under way. Oars in position, 5 of the Nautilus's sailors were waiting for us aboard the skiff, which was moored alongside. The night was still dark. Layers of clouds cloaked the sky and left only a few stars in view. My eyes flew to the side where the land lay, but I only saw the blurred line covering 3/4 of the horizon from southwest to northwest. Going up Ceylon's west coast during the night, the Nautilus lay west of the bay, or rather the gulf formed by the mainland and Mannar Island. Under these dark waters there stretched a bank of shellfish, an inexhaustible field of pearls, more than 20 miles long. Captain Nemo, Conseil, Ned Land, and I found seats in the stern of the skiff. The longboat's coxswain took the tiller, his 4 companions leaned into their oars, and the moorings were cast off, and we pulled clear. The skiff headed southward. The oarsmen took their time. I watched their strokes vigorously catch the water, and they always waited 10 seconds before rowing again, following the practice used in most navies. While the longboat coasted, drops of liquid flicked from the oars and hit the dark troughs of the waves, pitter-pattering like splashes of molten lead. Coming from well out, the mild swell made the skiff roll gently, and a few cresting billows lapped at its bow. We were silent. What was Captain Nemo thinking? Perhaps that this approaching the shore was too close for comfort, contrary to the Canadian's view, in which it still seemed too far away. As for Conseil, he had come along out of simple curiosity. Near 5:30, the first glimmers of the light on the horizon defined the upper lines of the coast with greater distinctness. Fairly flat to the east, it swelled a little towards the south. 5 miles still separated it from us. Its beach merged with the misty waters. Between us and the shore, the sea was deserted. Not a boat, not a diver. Profound solitude reigned over this gathering place of pearl fishermen. As Captain Nemo had commented, we are arriving in these waterways a month too soon. At 6 o'clock the day broke suddenly, with that speed unique to tropical regions, which experience no real dawn or dusk. The sun's rays pierced the cloud curtain gathered on the easterly horizon, and the radiant orb rose swiftly. I could clearly see the shore, which featured a few sparse trees here and there. The skiff advanced towards Mannar Island, which curved to the south. Captain Nemo stood up from his thwart and studied the sea. At his signal, the anchor was lowered, but its chain barely ran because the bottom lay no more than a meter down, and this locality was one of the shallowest spots near the bank of the shellfish. Instantly the skiff wheeled around under the ebb tide's outbound thrust. "We're here, Professor Aronnax," Captain Nemo said. "You observe this confined bay? A month from now, in this very place, the numerous fishing boats of the harvesters will gather, and these are the waters their divers will ransack so daringly. This bay is felicitously laid out for their type of fishing. It's sheltered from the strongest winds, and the sea is never very turbulent here. Highly favorable conditions for diving work. Now, let's put on our underwater suits, and we'll begin our stroll." I didn't reply, and while staring at these suspicious waves, I began to put on my heavy aquatic clothes, helped by the longboat's sailors. Captain Nemo and my two companions were suited up as well. None of the Nautilus's men were to go with us on this new excursion. Soon we were imprisoned to our necks in india-rubber clothing, and straps fastened the air devices to our backs. As for the Ruhmkorff device, it didn't seem to be in the picture. Before inserting my head into its copper capsule, I commented on this to the captain. "Our lighting equipment would be useless to us," the captain answered me. "We won't be going very deep, and the sun's rays will be sufficient to light our way. Besides, it's unwise to carry electric lanterns under these waves. Their brightness might unexpectedly attract certain dangerous occupants of these waterways." As Captain Nemo pronounced these words, I turned to Conseil and Ned Land, but my two friends had already encased their craniums in their metal headgear, and they could neither hear nor reply. I had one question left to address Captain Nemo. "What about our weapons?" I asked him. "Our rifles." "Rifles? What for? Don't your mountaineers attack bears dagger in hand? And isn't steel surer than lead? Here's a sturdy blade. Slip it under your belt, and let's be off." I stared at my companions. They were armed in the same fashion, and Ned Land was also brandishing an enormous harpoon that he'd stowed in the skiff before leaving the Nautilus. Then, following the captain's example, I let myself be crowned with my heavy copper spear, and our air tanks immediately went into action. An instant later, the longboat sailors helped us overboard, one after the other, and we set foot on the level sand in 1.5 meters of water. Captain Nemo gave us his hand signal. We followed him down a gentle slope and disappeared under the waves. There the obsessive fears in my brain left me. I became surprisingly calm again. The ease with which I could move increased my confidence, and the many strange sights captivated my imagination. The sun was already sending sufficient light under these waves. The tiniest objects remained visible. After 10 minutes of walking, we were in 5 meters of water, and the terrain had become almost flat. Like a convoy of snipe over a marsh, there rose underfoot schools of unusual fish from the genus Monopterus, whose members have no fin but their tail. I recognized the Havanese eel, a genuine 8 centimeter serpent, with a bluish-gray belly, which, without the gold lines over its flanks, could easily be confused with the conger eel. From the butterfish genus, whose oval bodies are very flat, I observed several adorned in bright colors, but sporting a dorsal fin like a sickle, edible fish that, when dried and marinated, make an excellent dish, known by the name carawade. Then some sea poachers, fish belonging to the genus Asphidophorides, whose bodies are covered with scaly armor divided into 8 lengthwise sections. Meanwhile, as the sun got progressively higher, it lit up the watery mass more and more. The seafloor changed little by little. Its fine-grained sand was followed by a genuine causeway of smooth crags, covered by carpet of mollusks and zoophytes. Among other specimens in these 2 branches, I noted some window-pane oysters, with thin valves of unequal size, the type of ostracod unique to the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, then orange-hued lucina, with circular shells, all shaped auger shells, some of the Persian murex snails that subside the Nautilus, with such wonderful dyes, spiky periwinkles 15 centimeters long that rose under the waves like hands ready to grab you, turban snails with shells made of horn and bristling all over with spikes, lamp shells, edible duck clams that feed the Hindu marketplace, subtly luminous jellyfish of the species Pelagia panopraea, and finally some wonderful Oculina flabelliforma, magnificent sea fans that fashion one of the most luxuriant tree forms in the ocean. In the midst of this moving vegetation, under arbors of water plants, there raced legions of clumsy articulates, in particular some fanged frog crabs, whose carapaces forms slightly rounded triangle, robber crabs exclusive to these waterways, and horrible parthenope crabs, whose appearance was repulsive to the eye. One animal no less hideous, which I encountered several times, was the enormous crab that Mr. Darwin had observed, to which nature had given the instinct and requisite strength to eat coconuts. It scrambles up trees on the beach, and sends the coconuts tumbling. They fracture in their fall, and are opened by its powerful pincers. Here, under these clear waves, this crab raced around with matchless agility, while green turtles from the species frequenting the Malabar coast moved sluggishly among the crumbling rocks. Near 7 o'clock we finally surveyed the bank of shellfish, where pearl oysters reproduce by the millions. These valuable mollusks stick to the rocks, where they're strongly attached with a mass of brown filaments that forbids their moving about. In this respect, oysters are inferior to even mollusks, to whom nature has not denied all talent for locomotion. The shellfish Meleagrina, that womb for pearls, whose valves are nearly equal in size, has a shape of a round shell with thick walls and very rough exterior. Some of the shells were furrowed with flaky, greenish bands that radiated down from the top. These were the young oysters. The others had rugged black surfaces, measured up to 15 centimeters in width, and were 10 or more years old. Captain Nemo pointed to this prodigious heap of shellfish, and I saw these mines were genuinely inexhaustible, since nature's creative powers are greater than man's destructive instincts. True to those instincts, Ned Land greedily stuffed the finest of these mollusks into a net he'd carried at his side. But we couldn't stop. We had to follow the captain, who led down trails seemingly known only to him. The seafloor rose noticeably, and when I lifted my arms, sometimes they would pass above the surface of the sea. Then the level of the oyster bank would lower unpredictably. Often we went around tall pointed rocks rising like pyramids. In their dark crevices hung crustaceans, aiming their long legs like heavy artillery, watched us with unblinking eyes, while underfoot there crept millipedes, bloodworms, acreoworms, and annelid worms, whose antennae and tubular tentacles were incredibly long. Just then, a huge cave opened up in our path, hollowed from a picturesque pile of rocks, whose smooth heights were completely hung with underwater flora. At first, this cave looked pitch black to me. Inside, the sun's rays seemed to diminish by degrees. Their hazy transparency was nothing more than a drowned light. Captain Nemo went in. We followed him. My eyes grew accustomed to this comparative gloom. I distinguished the unpredictably contoured springlings of a vault, supported by natural pillars firmly based on a granite foundation, like the weighty columns of Tuscan architecture. Why had our incomprehensible guide taken us into the depths of this underwater crypt? I would soon find out. After going down a fairly steep slope, our feet trod the floor of a sort of circular pit. There Captain Nemo stopped, and his hand indicated an object I had not yet noticed. It was an oyster of extraordinary dimensions, a titanic giant clam, a holy water font that could have held the whole lake, a basin more than 2 meters wide. Hence, even bigger than the one adorning the Nautilus's lounge. I approached this phenomenal mollusk. Its massive filaments attached it to a table of granite, and there it grew by itself in the midst of the cave's calm waters. I estimated the weight of this giant clam at 300 kilograms. Hence, such an oyster held 15 kilos of meat, and you need the stomach of King Gargantua to eat a couple dozen. Captain Nemo was obviously familiar with this bivalve's existence. This wasn't the first time he'd paid a visit to it, and I thought his sole reason for leading us to this locality was to show us a natural curiosity. I was mistaken. Captain Nemo had an explicit personal interest in checking on the current condition of this giant clam. The mollusk's 2 valves were partly open. The captain approached it and stuck his dagger vertically between the shells to discourage any ideas of closing up. Then with his hands he raised the fringed, membrane-filled tunic that made up the animal's mantle. There, between the leaf-like folds, I saw a loose pearl as big as a coconut, its globular shape, perfect clarity, and a wonderful orient made it a jewel of incalculable value. Carried away by curiosity, I stretched out my hand to take it, weigh it, fondle it, but the captain stopped me, signaled no, removed his dagger in one swift motion, and let the 2 valves snap shut. I then understood Captain Nemo's intent. By leaving the pearl buried beneath the giant clam's mantle, he had allowed it to grow imperceptibly. With each passing year the mollusk's secretions added new concentric layers. The captain alone was familiar with the cave where this wonderful fruit of nature was ripening. He alone reared it, so to speak, in order to transfer it one day to his dearly beloved museum. Perhaps, following the examples of oyster farms in China and India, he had even predetermined the creation of this pearl, by sticking under the mollusk's fold some piece of glass or metal that was gradually covered with mother-of-pearl. In any case, comparing this pearl to others I already knew about, and to those shimmering in the captain's collection, I estimated that it was worth at least 10 million francs. It was a superb natural curiosity, rather than a luxurious piece of jewelry, because I don't know any female ear that could handle it. Our visit to this opulent giant clam came to an end. Captain Nemo left the cave, and we climbed back up the bank of shellfish in the midst of these clear waters, not yet disturbed by divers at work. We walked by ourselves, genuine loiterers, stopping or straying as our fancy dictated. For my part, I was no longer worried about those dangers my imagination had so ridiculously exaggerated. The shallows drew noticeably closer to the surface of the sea, and soon, walking in only a meter of water, my head passed well above the level of the ocean. Conseil rejoined me, and gluing his huge copper capsule to mine, his eyes gave me a friendly greeting. But this lofty plateau measured only a few fathoms, and soon we re-entered our element. I think I've now earned the right to dub it that. 10 minutes later, Captain Nemo stopped suddenly. I thought he'd called a halt so we could turn and start back. No. With a gesture, he ordered us to crouch beside him at the foot of a wide crevice. His hand motioned towards a spot with a liquid mass, and I looked carefully. 5 meters away, a shadow appeared and dropped to the sea floor. The alarming idea of sharks crossed my mind, but I was mistaken, and once again we didn't have to deal with the monsters of the deep. It was a man, a living man, a black Indian fisherman, a poor devil, who no doubt had come to gather what he could before harvest time. I saw the bottom of his dinghy, moored a few feet above his head. He would dive and go back up in quick succession, cut in the shape of a sugar loaf, which he gripped between his feet, while a rope connected to his boat served to lower him more quickly to the ocean floor. This was the extent of his equipment. Arriving on the sea floor at a depth of 5 meters, he fell to his knees and stuffed his sack with shellfish, gathered at random. Then he went back, emptied his sack, pulled up his stone, and started all over again, the whole process lasting only 30 seconds. This diver didn't see us. A shadow cast by our crag hid us from his view. And besides, how could this poor Indian ever have guessed that human beings, creatures like himself, were near him under the waves, eavesdropping on his movements, not missing a single detail of his fishing? So he went up and down several times. He gathered only about 10 shellfish per dive, because he had to tear them from the banks where each clung with its tough mass of filaments. And how many of these oysters, for which he risked his life, would have no pearl in them? I observed him with great care. His movements were systematically executed, and for half an hour no danger seemed to threaten him. So I'd gotten used to the sight of his fascinating fishing, when all at once, just as the Indian was kneeling on the sea floor, I saw him make a frightened gesture, stand, gather himself, and spring back to the surface of the waves. I understood his fear. A gigantic shadow appeared above the poor diver. It was a shark of huge size, moving in diagonally, eyes ablaze, jaws wide open. I was speechless with horror, unable to make a single movement. With one vigorous stroke of its fin, the voracious animal shot towards the Indian, who jumped aside and avoided the shark's bite, but not the thrashing of its tail, because that tail struck him across the chest and stretched him out on the sea floor. This scene lasted barely a few seconds. The shark returned, rolled over on its back, and was ready to cut the Indian in half when Captain Nemo, who was stationed beside me, suddenly stood up. Then he strode right toward the monster, dagger in hand, ready to fight it at close quarters. Just as it was about to snap up the poor fisherman, the man-eater saw its new adversary, repositioned itself on its belly, and headed swiftly toward him. I can see Captain Nemo's bearing to this day. Bracing himself, he waited for the fearsome man-eater with a wonderful composure, and when the latter rushed at him, the captain leaped aside with prodigious quickness, avoided a collision, and sank his dagger into its belly. But that wasn't the end of the story. A dreadful battle was joined. The shark bellowed, so to speak. Blood was pouring into the waves from its wounds. The sea was dyed red, and through its opaque liquid I could see nothing else, until the moment when, through the rift of clouds, I saw the daring captain clinging to one of the animal's fins, fighting the monster at close quarters, belaboring his enemy's belly with the stabs of the dagger, yet unable to deliver the deciding thrust in the other world, a direct hit to the heart. In its struggles, the man-eater churned the watery mass so furiously its eddies threatened to knock me over. I wanted to run to the captain's rescue, but I was transfixed with horror, unable to move. I stared wild-eyed. I saw the fight enter a new phase. The captain fell to the sea floor, toppled by the enormous mass weighing him down. Then the shark's jaws opened astoundingly wide, like a pair of industrial shears. And that would have been the finish of Captain Nemo, had not Ned Land, quick as thought, rushed forward with his harpoon and driven its dreadful point into the shark's underside. The waves were saturated with masses of blood. The waters shook with its movements of the man-eater, which thrashed about with indescribable fury. Ned Land hadn't missed his target. This was the monster's death rattle. Pierced to the heart, it was struggling with dreadful spasms, whose aftershocks knocked Conseil off his feet. Meanwhile, Ned Land pulled the captain clear. Uninjured, the latter stood up, went right to the Indian, quickly cut the rope binding the man to his stone, and took the fellow in his arms, and with a vigorous kick of the heel, rose to the surface of the sea. The three of us followed him, and a few moments later, miraculously safe, we reached the fisherman's longboat. Captain Nemo's first concern was to revive this unfortunate man. I wasn't sure he would succeed. I hoped so, since the poor devil hadn't been under very long. But that stroke from the shark's tail could have been his death blow. Fortunately, after vigorously massaging by Conseil and the captain, I saw the nearly drowned man regain consciousness. Little by little, he opened his eyes. How startled he must have felt, how frightened even, at seeing 4 huge copper craniums leaning over him. And above all, what must he have thought when Captain Nemo pulled a bag of pearls from his pocket of his diving suit and placed them in the fisherman's hands? This magnificent benefaction from the man of the waters to the poor Indian from Ceylon was accepted by the latter with trembling hands. His bewildered eyes indicated that he didn't know to what superhuman creatures he owed both his life and his fortune. At the captain's signal, we returned to the bank of the shellfish, and retracing our steps, we walked for half an hour until we encountered the anchor connecting the sea floor with the Nautilus's skiff. Back on board, the sailors helped divest us of our heavy copper carapaces. Captain Nemo's first words were spoken to the Canadian. "Thank you, Mr. Land," he told him. "Tit for tat, Captain," Ned Land replied. "I owed it to you." The ghost of a smile glided across the captain's lips, and that was all. "To the Nautilus," he said. The longboat flew over the waves. A few minutes later we encountered the shark's corpse again, floating. From the black markings on the tips of its fins, I recognized the dreadful Squalus melanopterus from the seas of the East Indies, a variety of the species of the sharks proper. It was more than 25 feet long. Its enormous mouth occupied a third of its body. It was an adult, as could be seen from the 6 rows of teeth forming an isosceles triangle in its upper jaw. Conseil looked at it with purely scientific fascination, and I'm sure he placed it, not without good reason, in the class of the cartilaginous fish, order Chondropterygia, with fixed gills, family Selachia, genus Squalus. And while I was contemplating this inert mass, suddenly a dozen of these voracious menoptera appeared around our longboat, but paying no attention to us, they pounced on the corpse and quarreled over every scrap of it. By 8:30 we were back aboard the Nautilus. There, I fell to thinking about the incidents that marked our excursion over the Mannar oysterbank. 2 impressions inevitably stood out. One concerned Captain Nemo's matchless bravery, the other the devotion to a human being, a representative of that race from which he had fled beneath the seas. In spite of everything, this strange man hadn't yet succeeded in completely stifling his heart. When I shared these impressions with him, he answered me in a tone touched with emotion. "That Indian, Professor, lives in the land of the oppressed, and I am to this day, and will be until my last breath, a native of that same land." End of chapter 27. Recording by ReadWriteLib.
Chapter 4 of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Translated by F.P. Walter. Part 2, Chapter 4. The Red Sea. During the day of January 29th, the island of Ceylon disappeared below the horizon, and at a speed of 20 miles per hour, the Nautilus glided into the labyrinthine channels that separate the Maldive and Laccadive Islands. It likewise hugged Kilton Island, a shore of madreporic origin discovered by Vasco da Gama in 1499, and one of the 19 chief islands in the group of the Laccadives, located between latitude 10 degrees and 14 degrees 30 minutes north, and between longitude 50 degrees 72 minutes, and 69 degrees east. By then we had fared 16,220 miles, or 7,500 leagues, from our starting point in the seas of Japan. The next day, January 30th, when the Nautilus rose to the surface of the ocean, there was no more land in sight. Setting its course to the north-northwest, the ship headed toward the Gulf of Oman, carved out between Arabia and the Indian Peninsula, and providing access to the Persian Gulf. This was obviously a blind alley with no possible outlet. So where was Captain Nemo taking us? I was unable to say, which didn't satisfy the Canadian, who that day asked me where we were going. "We're going, Mr. Ned, where the captain's fancy takes us." "His fancy," the Canadian replied, "won't take us very far. The Persian Gulf has no outlet, and if we enter those waters, it won't be long before we return in our tracks." "All right, we'll return, Mr. Land, and after the Persian Gulf, if the Nautilus wants to visit the Red Sea, the Strait of Bab el Mandeb is still there to let us in." "I don't have to tell you, sir," Ned Land replied, "that the Red Sea is just as landlocked as the Gulf, since the Isthmus of Suez hasn't been cut all the way through yet. And even if it was, a boat as secretive as ours wouldn't risk a canal intersected with locks, so the Red Sea won't be our way back to Europe either." "But I didn't say we'd return to Europe." "What do you figure, then?" "I figure that after visiting these unusual waterways of Arabia and Egypt, the Nautilus will go back down to the Indian Ocean, perhaps through Mozambique Channel, perhaps off the Mascarene Islands, and then make for the Cape of Good Hope." "And once we're at the Cape of Good Hope?" the Canadian asked with typical persistence. "Well then, we'll enter the Atlantic Ocean, with which we aren't yet familiar. What's wrong, Ned, my friend? Are you still tired of this voyage under the seas? Are you bored with the constantly changing sight of these underwater wonders? Speaking for myself, I'll be extremely distressed to see the end of a voyage so few men will ever have a chance to make." "But don't you realize, Professor Aronnax," the Canadian replied, "that soon we'll have been imprisoned for 3 whole months aboard this Nautilus?" "No, Ned, I didn't realize it. I don't want to realize it, and I don't keep track of every day and every hour." "But when will it be over?" "In its appointed time. Meanwhile, there's nothing we can do about it, and our discussions are futile. My gallant Ned, if you come and tell me a chance of escape is available to us, then I'll discuss it with you. But that isn't the case, and in all honesty, I don't think Captain Nemo ever ventures into European seas." This short dialogue reveals that in my mania for the Nautilus, I was turning into the spitting image of its commander. As for Ned Land, he ended our talk in his best speechifying style. "That's all fine and dandy, but in my humble opinion, a life in jail is a life without joy." For 4 days, until February 3rd, the Nautilus inspected the Gulf of Oman at various speeds and depths. It seemed to be traveling at random, as if hesitating over which course to follow, but it never crossed the Tropic of Cancer. After leaving this gulf, we raised Muscat for an instant, the most important town in the country of Oman. I marveled at its strange appearance in the midst of the black rocks surrounding it, against which the white of its houses and forts stood out sharply. I spotted the rounded domes of its mosques, the elegant tips of its minarets, and its fresh leafy terraces. But it was only a fleeting vision, and the Nautilus soon sank beneath the dark waves of these waterways. Then our ship went along at a distance of 6 miles from the Arabian coast of Mara and Hadramaut, their undulating lines of mountains relieved by a few ancient ruins. On February 5th we finally put into the Gulf of Aden, a genuine funnel stuck into the neck of Bab el Mandeb, and bottling these Indian waters in the Red Sea. On February 6th, the Nautilus cruised in sight of the city of Aden, perched on a promontory connected to the continent by a narrow isthmus, a sort of inaccessible Gibraltar whose fortifications the English rebuilt after capturing it in 1839. I glimpsed the octagonal minarets of this town, which used to be one of the wealthiest, busiest commercial centers along this coast, as the Arab historian Idrisi tells it. I was convinced that when Captain Nemo reached this point he would back out again, but I was mistaken, and much to my surprise, he did nothing of the sort. The next day, February 7th, we entered the Strait of Bab el Mandeb, whose name means Gate of Tears in the Arabic language. 20 miles wide, it's only 52 kilometers long, and with the Nautilus launched at full speed, clearing it was the work of barely an hour. But I didn't see a thing, not even Perim Island, where the British government built fortifications to strengthen Aden's position. There were many English and French steamers plowing this narrow passageway, liners going from Suez to Bombay, Calcutta, Melbourne, Reunion Island, and Mauritius. Far too much traffic for the Nautilus to make an appearance on the surface, so it wisely stayed in mid-water. Finally, at noon, we were plowing the waves of the Red Sea. The Red Sea, that great lake so famous in biblical traditions, seldom replenished by rains, fed by no important rivers, continually drained by a high rate of evaporation, its water level dropping 1.5 meters every year. If it were fully landlocked like a lake, this odd gulf might dry up completely. On this score, it's inferior to its neighbors, the Caspian Sea and the Dead Sea, whose levels lower only to the point where their evaporation exactly equals the amounts of water they take to their hearts. This Red Sea is 2,600 kilometers long, with an average width of 240. In the days of the Ptolemies and the Roman emperors, it was a great commercial artery for the world, and when its isthmus has been cut through, it will completely regain that bygone importance that the Suez railways have already brought back in part. I would not even attempt to understand the whim that induced Captain Nemo to take us into this gulf, but I wholeheartedly approved of the Nautilus's entering it. It adopted a medium pace, sometimes staying on the surface, sometimes diving to avoid some ship, and so I could observe both the inside and the top side of this highly unusual sea. On February 8th, as early as the first hours of daylight, Mocha appeared before us, a town now in ruins, whose walls would collapse at the mere sound of a cannon, and which shelters a few leafy date trees here and there. This once important city used to contain 6 public marketplaces, plus 26 mosques, and its walls, protected by 14 forts, fashioned a 3-kilometer girdle around it. Then the Nautilus drew near the beaches of Africa, where the sea is considerably deeper. There, through the open panels, and in a mid-water of crystal clarity, our ship enabled us to study wonderful bushes of shining coral and huge chunks of rock wrapped in splendid green furs of algae and fucus. What an indescribable sight, and what a variety of settings and scenery were these reefs and volcanic islands leveled off by the Libyan coast! But soon the Nautilus hugged the eastern shore, where these tree forms appear in all their glory. This was off the coast of Tihama, and there such zoophyte displays not only flourished below sea level, but they also fashioned picturesque networks that unreeled as high as 10 fathoms above it. The latter were more whimsical, but less colorful than the former, which kept their blooms thanks to the moist vitality of the waters. How many delightful hours I spent in this way at the lounge window! How many new specimens of underwater flora and fauna I marveled at beneath the light of our electric beacon! Mushroom-shaped fungus coral, some slate-colored sea anemone including the species Thalassacianthus aster, among others, organ-pipe coral arranged like flutes and just begging for a puff from the god Pan, shells unique to this sea that dwell in madreporic cavities and whose bases are twisted into squat spirals, and finally 1,000 samples of a polypary I hadn't observed until then, the common sponge. The class Spongiaria has been created by scientists precisely for this unusual exhibit whose usefulness is beyond dispute. The sponge is definitely not a plant, as some naturalists still believe, but an animal of the lowest order, a polypary inferior even to coral. Its animal nature isn't in doubt, and we can't accept even the view of the ancients who regarded it as halfway between plant and animal, but I must say that naturalists are not in agreement on the structural mode of sponges. For some, it's a polypary, and for others, such as Professor Milne Edwards, it's a single solitary individual. The class Spongiaria contains about 300 species that are encountered in a large number of seas, and even in certain streams, where they've been given the name freshwater sponges. But their waters of choice are the Red Sea and the Mediterranean near the Greek islands or the coast of Syria. These waters witness the reproduction and growth of soft, delicate bath sponges whose prices run as high as 150 francs apiece, the yellow sponge from Syria, the horn sponge from Barbary, etc. But since I had no hope of studying these zoophytes in the seaports of the Levant, from which we were separated by the insuperable Isthmus of Suez, I had to be content with observing them in the waters of the Red Sea. So I called Conseil to my side. While at an average depth of 8 to 9 meters, the Nautilus slowly skimmed every beautiful rock on the easterly coast. There, sponges grew in every shape, globular, star-like, leaf-like, finger-like. With reasonable accuracy, they lived up to their nicknames of basket sponges, chalice sponges, distaff sponges, elkhorn sponges, lion's paws, peacock's tails, and Neptune's gloves, designations bestowed on them by fishermen, more poetically inclined than scientists. A gelatinous semi-fluid substance coated the fibrous tissue of these sponges, and from this tissue there escaped a steady trickle of water that, after carrying sustenance to each cell, was expelled by a contracting movement. This jelly-like substance disappears when the polyp dies, emitting ammonia as it rots. Finally, nothing remains but the fibers, either gelatinous or made of horn, that constitute your household sponge, which takes on a russet hue and is used for various tasks depending upon its degree of elasticity, permeability, or resistance to saturation. These polypores were sticking to rocks, shells of mollusks, and even the stalks of water plants. They adorned the smallest crevices, some sprawling, others standing or hanging like coral outgrowths. I told Conseil that sponges are fished up in two ways, either by dragnet or by hand. The latter method calls for the services of a diver, but it's preferable because it spares the polypore's tissue, leaving it with a much higher market value. Other zoophytes swarming near the sponges consisted chiefly of a very elegant species of jellyfish. Mollusks were represented by varieties of squid that, according to Professor Orbigny, are unique to the Red Sea, and reptiles by the vergata turtles belonging to the genus Chelonia, which furnished our table with a dainty but wholesome dish. As for fish, they were numerous and often remarkable. Here are the ones the Nautilus's nets most frequently hauled on board. Rays, including spotted rays that were oval in shape and brick red in color, their bodies strewn with erratic blue speckles and identifiable by their jagged double stings, silver-backed skates, common stingrays with stippled tails, butterfly rays that looked like huge 2-meter cloaks flapping at mid-depth, toothless guitarfish that were a type of cartilaginous fish closer to the shark, trunkfish known as dromedaries that were 1.5 feet long and had humps ending in backward curving stings, serpentine moray eels with silver tails and bluish backs, plus brown pectorals trimmed in gray piping, a species of butterfish called the fiatola, decked out in thin gold stripes and the 3 colors of the French flag, Montague blennies 4 decimeters long, superb jacks handsomely embellished by 7 black crosswise streaks with blue and yellow fins, plus gold and silver scales, snooks, standard mullet with yellow heads, parrotfish, wrasse, tigerfish, gobies, etc., plus 1,000 other fish common to the oceans we had already crossed. On February 9th, the Nautilus cruised in the widest part of the Red Sea, measuring 190 miles straight across from Sakin on the west coast to Kunfida on the east coast. At noon, that day after our position fix, Captain Nemo climbed onto the platform where I happened to be. I vowed not to let him go below again without at least sounding him out on his future plans. As soon as he saw me, he came over, graciously offered me a cigar, and said to me, "Well, Professor, are you pleased with this Red Sea? Have you seen enough of its hidden wonders, its fish and zoophytes, its garden of sponges and forests of coral? Have you glimpsed the towns built on its shores?" "Yes, Captain Nemo," I replied, "and the Nautilus is wonderfully suited to this whole survey. Ah, it's a clever boat." "Yes, sir, clever and daring, and invulnerable. It fears neither the Red Sea's dreadful storms nor its currents and reefs." "Indeed," I said, "this sea is mentioned as one of the worst, and in the days of the ancients, if I'm not mistaken, it had an abominable reputation." "Thoroughly abominable, Professor Aronnax. The Greek and Latin historians can find nothing to say in its favor, and the Greek geographer Strabo adds it's especially rough during the rainy season and the period of summer prevailing winds. The Arab Idrisi, referring to it by the name of Gulf of Kulzum, relates that ships perished in large numbers on its sandbanks, and that no one risked navigating it by night. This, he claims, is a sea subject to fearful hurricanes, strewn with inhospitable islands, and with nothing good to offer, either on its surface or in its depths. As a matter of fact, the same views can also be found in Arion, Agathorchides, and Artemidorus." "One can easily see," I answered, "that those historians didn't navigate aboard the Nautilus." "Indeed," the captain replied with a smile, "and in this respect, the moderns aren't much further along than the ancients. It took many centuries to discover the mechanical power of steam. Who knows whether we'll see a second Nautilus within the next 100 years? Progress is slow, Professor Aronnax." "It's true," I replied. "Your ship is a century ahead of its time, perhaps several centuries. It would be most unfortunate if such a secret were to die with its inventor." Captain Nemo did not reply. After some minutes of silence, "We were discussing," he said, "the views of ancient historians on the dangers of navigating the Red Sea." "True," I replied, "but weren't their fears exaggerated?" "Yes and no, Professor Aronnax," answered Captain Nemo, who seemed to know his Red Sea by heart. to a modern ship, well rigged, solidly constructed, and in control of its course, thanks to obedient steam, some conditions are no longer hazardous that offered all sorts of dangers to the vessels of the ancients. Picture those early navigators venturing forth in sailboats built from planks lashed together with palm tree ropes, caulked with powdered resin, and coated with dogfish grease. They didn't even have instruments for taking their bearings. They went by guesswork in the midst of currents they barely knew. Under such conditions, shipwrecks had to be numerous. But nowadays, steamers providing service between Suez and the South Seas have nothing to fear from the fury of this gulf, despite the contrary winds of its monsoons. Their captains and passengers no longer prepare for departure with sacrifices to placate the gods, and after returning, they don't traipse in wreaths and gold ribbons to say thanks at the local temple. Agreed, I said. And steam seems to have killed off all gratitude in seamen's hearts. But since you seem to have made a special study of this sea, Captain, can you tell me how it got its name? Many explanations exist on the subject, Professor Aronnax. Would you like to hear the views of one chronicler in the 14th century? Gladly. This fanciful fellow claims the sea was given its name after the crossing of the Israelites, when the Pharaoh perished in those waves that came together again at Moses' command. To mark that miraculous sequel, the sea turned red without equal. Thus no other course would do, but to name it for its hue. An artistic explanation, Captain Nemo, I replied, but I'm unable to rest content with it, so I'll ask you for your own personal views. Here they come. To my thinking, Professor Aronnax, this Red Sea designation must be regarded as a translation of the Hebrew word Edrom, and if the ancients gave it that name, it was because of the unique color of its waters. Until now, however, I've only seen clear waves without any unique hue. Surely, but as we move ahead to the far end of this gulf, you will notice its odd appearance. I recall seeing the Bay of El Tur completely red, like a lake of blood. And you attribute this color to the presence of microscopic algae? Yes, it's a purplish mucilaginous substance produced by those tiny buds known by the name trichodesmia, 40,000 of which are needed to occupy the space of 1 square millimeter. Perhaps you'll encounter them when we reach El Tur. Hence, Captain Nemo, this isn't the first time you've gone through the Red Sea aboard the Nautilus. No, sir. Then, since you've already mentioned the crossing of the Israelites and the catastrophe that befell the Egyptians, I would ask if you've ever discovered any traces under the waters of that great historic event. No, Professor, and for an excellent reason. What's that? It's because the same locality where Moses crossed with all his people is now so clogged with sand, camels can barely get their legs wet. You can understand that my Nautilus wouldn't have enough water for itself. And that locality is? I asked. That locality lies a little above Suez, in a sound that used to form a deep estuary when the Red Sea stretched as far as the Bitter Lakes. Now, whether or not their crossing was literally miraculous, the Israelites did cross there in returning to the Promised Land, and the Pharaoh's army did perish at precisely that locality, so I think that excavating those sands would bring to light a great many weapons and tools of Egyptian origin. Obviously, I replied, and for the sake of archaeology, let's hope that sooner or later such excavations do take place. Once new towns are settled on the isthmus after the Suez Canal has been cut through, a canal, by the way, of little use to a ship such as the Nautilus. Surely, but of great use to the world at large, Captain Nemo said. The ancients well understood the usefulness to commerce of connecting the Red Sea with the Mediterranean, but they never dreamed of cutting a canal between the two. Instead, they picked the Nile as their link. If we can trust tradition, it was probably Egypt's king Sesostris who started digging the canal needed to join the Nile with the Red Sea. What's certain is that by 615 BC, King Necho II was hard at work on a canal that was fed by Nile water and ran through the Egyptian plains opposite Arabia. This canal could be traveled in 4 days, and it was so wide, 2 triple-tiered galleys could pass through it abreast. Its construction was continued by Darius the Great, son of Hystaspes, and probably completed by King Ptolemy II. Strabo saw it used for shipping, but the weakness of its slope between its starting point near Bubastis and the Red Sea left it navigable only a few months out of the year. This canal served commerce until the century of Rome's Antonine emperors. It was then abandoned and covered with sand, subsequently reinstated by Arabia's Caliph Omar I, and finally filled in for good in 761 or 762 AD by Caliph al-Mansur, in an effort to prevent supplies from reaching Muhammad ibn Abdullah, who had rebelled against him. During his Egyptian campaign, your general Napoleon Bonaparte discovered traces of this old canal in the Suez Desert, and when the tide caught him by surprise, he well-nigh perished just a few hours before rejoining his regiment at Hajeroth, the very place where Moses had pitched camp 3,300 years before him. Well, Captain, what the ancients hesitated to undertake, Mr. de Lesseps is now finishing up. His joining of these two seas will shorten the route from Cadiz to the East Indies by 9,000 kilometers, and he'll soon change Africa into an immense island. Yes, Professor Aronnax, and you have every right to be proud of your fellow countrymen. Such a man brings a nation more honor than the greatest commanders. Like so many others, he began with difficulties and setbacks, but he triumphed because he has the volunteer spirit. And it's sad to think that this deed, which should have been international indeed, which would have ensured that any administration went down in history, will succeed only through the efforts of one man. So all hail to Mr. de Lesseps. Yes, all hail to that great French citizen, I replied, quite startled by how emphatically Captain Nemo had just spoken. Unfortunately, he went on, I can't take you through that Suez Canal, but the day after tomorrow you'll be able to see the long jetties of Port Said when we're in the Mediterranean. In the Mediterranean, I exclaimed. Yes, Professor, does that amaze you? What amazes me is thinking that we'll be there the day after tomorrow. Oh, really? Yes, Captain, although since I've been aboard your vessel, I should have formed the habit of not being amazed by anything. But what is it that startles you? The thought of how hideously fast the Nautilus will need to go if we'll double the Cape of Good Hope, circle around Africa, and lie in the open Mediterranean by the day after tomorrow. And who says it will circle Africa, Professor? What is this talk of doubling the Cape of Good Hope? But unless the Nautilus navigates on dry land and crosses over the isthmus, or under it, Professor Aronnax. Under it? Surely, Captain Nemo replied sternly. Under that tongue of land, nature long ago made what man today is making on its surface. What? There is a passageway? Yes, an underground passageway that I've named the Arabian Tunnel. It starts below Suez and leads to the Bay of Pelusium. But isn't that isthmus only composed of quicksand? To a certain depth, but at merely 50 meters one encounters a firm foundation of rock. And it's by luck that you discovered this passageway? I asked, more and more startled. Luck plus logic, Professor, and logic even more than luck. Captain, I hear you, but I can't believe my ears. Oh, sir, the old saying still holds. Auris habent et non audient. Latin, they have ears but do not hear. Editor. Not only does this passageway exist, but I've taken advantage of it on several occasions. Without it, I wouldn't have ventured today into such a blind alley as the Red Sea. Is it indiscreet to ask how you discovered this tunnel? Sir, the captain answered me, there can be no secrets between men who will never leave each other. I ignored this innuendo and waited for Captain Nemo's explanation. Professor, he told me, the simple logic of the naturalist led me to discover this passageway, and I alone am familiar with it. I noted that in the Red Sea and the Mediterranean there exist a number of absolutely identical species of fish, eel, butterfish, greenfish, bass, jewelfish, flying fish. Certain of this fact, I wondered if there wasn't a connection between the two seas. If there were, its underground current had to go from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean simply because of their difference in level. So I caught a large number of fish in the vicinity of Suez. I slipped copper rings around their tails and tossed them back into the sea. A few months later, off the coast of Syria, I recaptured a few specimens of my fish, adorned with their telltale rings. So this proved to me that some connection existed between the two seas. I searched for it with my Nautilus. I discovered it. I ventured into it. And soon, Professor, you also will have cleared my Arabic tunnel. End of Part 2, Chapter 4. Chapter 5 of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Part 2, Chapter 5, Arabian Tunnel. The same day I reported to Conseil and Ned Land that part of the foregoing conversation directly concerning them. When I told them we would be lying in Mediterranean waters within 2 days, Conseil clapped his hands, but the Canadian shrugged his shoulders. An underwater tunnel, he exclaimed. A connection between two seas. Who ever heard such malarkey? Ned, my friend, Conseil replied, had you ever heard of the Nautilus? No? Yet here it is. So don't shrug your shoulders so blithely, and don't discount something with the feeble excuse that you've never heard of it. We'll soon see, Ned Land shot back, shaking his head. After all, I'd like nothing better than to believe in your captain's little passageway, and may heaven grant it really does take us to the Mediterranean. That same evening, at latitude 21 degrees 30 minutes north, the Nautilus was afloat on the surface of the sea and drawing nearer to the Arab coast. I spotted Jeddah, an important financial center for Egypt, Syria, Turkey, and the East Indies. I could distinguish with reasonable clarity the overall effect of its buildings, the ships made fast along its wharves, and those bigger vessels whose draft of water required them to drop anchor at the port's offshore mooring. The sun, fairly low on the horizon, struck full force on the houses in this town, accenting their whiteness. Outside the city limits, some wood or reed huts indicated the quarter where the Bedouins lived. Soon Jeddah faded into the shadows of evening, and the Nautilus went back beneath the mildly phosphorescent waters. The next day, February 10th, several ships appeared, running on our opposite tack. The Nautilus resumed its underwater navigating, but at the moment of our noon sights, the sea was deserted, and the ship rose again to its waterline. With Ned and Conseil, I sat on the platform. The coast to the east looked like a slightly blurred mass in a damp fog. Leaning against the sides of the skiff, we were chatting of one thing and another, when Ned Land stretched his hands toward a point in the water, saying to me, "See anything out there, Professor?" "No, Ned," I replied, "but you know I don't have your eyes." "Take a good look," Ned went on. "There, ahead to the starboard, almost level with the beacon. Don't you see a mass that seems to be moving around?" "Right," I said, after observing carefully. "I can make out something like a long, blackish object on the surface of the water." "A second Nautilus?" Conseil said. "No," the Canadian replied. "Unless I'm badly mistaken, that's some marine animal." "Are there whales in the Red Sea?" Conseil asked. "Yes, my boy," I replied. "They're sometimes found here." "That's no whale," continued Ned Land, whose eyes never strayed from the object they had sighted. "We're old chums, whales and I couldn't mistake their little ways." "Let's wait and see," Conseil said. "The Nautilus is heading in that direction, and we'll soon know what we're in for." In fact, that blackish object was soon only a mile away from us. It looked like a huge reef stranded in mid-ocean. What was it? I still couldn't make up my mind. "Oh, it's moving off! It's diving!" Ned Land exclaimed. "Damnation, what can that animal be?" "It doesn't have a forked tail like baleen whales or sperm whales, and its fins look like sawed-off limbs." "But in that case," I put in. "Good Lord," the Canadian went on, "it's rolled over on its back, and it's raising its breasts in the air." "It's a siren!" Conseil exclaimed. "With all due respect to Master, it's an actual mermaid." The word siren put me back on track, and I realized that the animal belonged to the order Sirenia, marine creatures that legends have turned into mermaids, half woman, half fish. "No," I told Conseil, "that's no mermaid. It's an unusual creature of which only a few specimens are left in the Red Sea. That's a dugong." "Order Sirenia, group Pisciforma, subclass Monodelphia, class Mammalia, branch Vertebrata," Conseil replied. And when Conseil has spoken, there's nothing else to be said. Meanwhile, Ned Land kept staring. His eyes were gleaming with desire at the sight of that animal. His hands were ready to hurl a harpoon. You would have thought he was waiting for the right moment to jump overboard and attack the creature in its own element. "Oh, sir," he told me in a voice trembling with excitement, "I've never killed anything like that." His whole being was concentrated in this last word. Just then, Captain Nemo appeared on the platform. He spotted the dugong. He understood the Canadian's frame of mind and addressed him directly. "If you held a harpoon, Mr. Land, wouldn't your hands be itching to put it to work?" "Positively, sir." "And just for one day, would it displease you to return to your fisherman's trade and add this cetacean to the list of those you've already hunted down?" "It wouldn't displease me one bit." "All right, you can try your luck." "Thank you, sir," Ned Land replied, his eyes ablaze. "Only," the captain went on, "I urge you to aim carefully at this animal in your own personal interest." "Is the dugong dangerous to attack?" I asked, despite the Canadian's shrug of the shoulders. "Yes, sometimes," the captain replied. "These animals have been known to turn on their assailants and capsize their longboats, but with Mr. Land that danger isn't to be feared. His eye is sharp, his arm is sure. If I recommend that he aim carefully at this dugong, it's because the animal is justly regarded as fine game, and I know Mr. Land doesn't despise a choice morsel." "Aha!" the Canadian put in. "This beast offers the added luxury of being good to eat?" "Yes, Mr. Land. Its flesh is actual red meat, highly prized and set aside throughout Malaysia for the tables of aristocrats. Accordingly, this excellent animal has been hunted so bloodthirstily that, like its manatee relatives, it has become more and more scarce." "In that case, Captain," Conseil said in all seriousness, "on the off chance that this creature might be the last of its line, wouldn't it be advisable to spare its life, in the interests of science?" "Maybe," the Canadian answered. "It would be better to hunt it down in the interests of mealtime." "Then proceed, Mr. Land," Captain Nemo replied. Just then, as mute and emotionless as ever, 7 crewmen climbed onto the platform. One carried a harpoon and line similar to those used in whale fishing. Its deck paneling opened, the skiff was wrenched from its socket and launched to the sea. 6 rowers sat on the thwarts, and the coxswain took the tiller. Ned, Conseil, and I found seats in the stern. "Aren't you coming, Captain?" I asked. "No, sir, but I wish you happy hunting." The skiff pulled clear. It headed swiftly toward the dugong, which by then was floating 2 miles from the Nautilus. Arriving within a few cable lengths of the cetacean, our longboat slowed down, and the sculls dipped noiselessly into the tranquil waters. Harpoon in hand, Ned Land went to take his stand in the skiff's bow. Harpoons used for hunting whales are usually attached to a very long rope that pays out quickly when the wounded animal drags it with him. But this rope measured no more than about 10 fathoms, and its end had simply been fastened to a small barrel that, while floating, would indicate the dugong's movements beneath the waters. I stood up and could clearly observe the Canadian's adversary. This dugong, which also boasts the name halicore, closely resembled a manatee. Its oblong body ended in a very long caudal fin, and its lateral fins in actual fingers. It differs from the manatee in that its upper jaw is armed with 2 long, pointed teeth that form diverging tusks on either side. This dugong that Ned Land was preparing to attack was of colossal dimensions, easily exceeding 7 meters in length. It didn't stir and seemed to be sleeping on the surface of the waves, a circumstance that should have made it easier to capture. The skiff approached cautiously to within 3 fathoms of the animal. The oars hung suspended above their rowlocks. I was crouching. His body leaning slightly back, Ned Land brandished his harpoon with expert hands. Suddenly, a hissing sound was audible, and the dugong disappeared. Although the harpoon had been forcefully hurled, it apparently had hit only water. "Damnation!" exclaimed the furious Canadian. "I missed it!" "No," I said. "The animal's wounded. There's its blood. But your weapon didn't stick in its body." "My harpoon! Get my harpoon!" Ned Land exclaimed. The sailors went back to their sculling, and the coxswain steered the longboat toward the floating barrel. We fished up the harpoon, and the skiff started off in pursuit of the animal. The latter returned from time to time to breathe at the surface of the sea. Its wound hadn't weakened it because it went with tremendous speed. Driven by energetic arms, the longboat flew on its trail. Several times we got within a few fathoms of it, and the Canadian hovered in readiness to strike, but then the dugong would steal away with a sudden dive, and it proved impossible to overtake the beast. I'll let you assess the degree of anger consuming our impatient Ned Land. He hurled at the hapless animal the most potent swear words in the English language. For my part, I was simply distressed to see this dugong outwit our every scheme. We chased it unflaggingly for a full hour, and I'd begun to think it would prove too difficult to capture, when the animal got the untimely idea of taking revenge on us, a notion it would soon have cause to regret. It wheeled on the skiff to assault us in its turn. This maneuver did not escape the Canadian. "Watch out," he said. The coxswain pronounced a few words in his bizarre language, and no doubt he alerted his men to keep on their guard. Arriving within 20 feet of the skiff, the dugong stopped, sharply sniffing the air with its huge nostrils, pierced not at the tip of its muzzle but on its top side. Then it gathered itself and sprang at us. The skiff couldn't avoid the collision. Half overturned, it shipped a ton or two of water that we had to bail out, but thanks to our skillful coxswain, we were fouled on the bias rather than broadside, so we didn't capsize. Clinging to the stem post, Ned Land thrust his harpoon again and again into the gigantic animal, which embedded its teeth into our gunwale and lifted the longboat out of the water as a lion would lift a deer. We were thrown on top of each other, and I have no idea how the venture would have ended had not the Canadian, still thirsting for the beast's blood, finally pierced it to the heart. I heard its teeth grind on sheet iron, and the dugong disappeared, taking our harpoon along with it. But the barrel soon popped up to the surface, and a few moments later the animal's body appeared and rolled over on its back. Our skiff rejoined it, took it in tow, and headed to the Nautilus. It took pulleys of great strength to hoist this dugong onto the platform. The beast weighed 5,000 kilograms. It was carved up in sight of the Canadian, who remained to watch every detail of the operation. At dinner the same day, my steward served me some slices of this flesh, skillfully dressed by the ship's cook. I found it excellent, even better than veal, if not beef. The next morning, February 11th, the Nautilus's pantry was enriched by more dainty game. A covey of terns alighted on the Nautilus. They were a species of Stona nilotica, unique to Egypt. Beak black, head gray and stippled, eyes surrounded by white dots, back, wings, and tail grayish, belly and throat white, feet red. Also caught were a couple dozen Nile duck, superior tasting wildfowl whose neck and crown of the head are white, speckled with black. By then the Nautilus had reduced speed. It moved ahead at a saunter, so to speak. I observed that the Red Sea's water was becoming less salty the closer we got to Suez. Nearly 5 o'clock in the afternoon we sighted Cape Ras Mohammed to the north. This cape forms the tip of Arabia Petraea, which lies beneath the Gulf of Suez and the Gulf of Aqaba. The Nautilus entered the Strait of Jubal, which leads to the Gulf of Suez. I could clearly make out a high mountain crowning Ras Mohammed between the two gulfs. It was Mount Horeb, that biblical Mount Sinai on whose summits Moses met God face to face. That summit the mind's eye always pictures as wreathed in lightning. At 6 o'clock, sometimes afloat and sometimes submerged, the Nautilus passed well out from El Tur, which sat at the far end of a bay whose waters seemed to be dyed red, as Captain Nemo had already mentioned. Then night fell in the midst of a heavy silence occasionally broken by the calls of pelicans and nocturnal birds, by the sound of surf chafing against rocks, or by the distant moan of a steamer churning the waves of the Gulf with noisy blades. From 8 to 9 o'clock the Nautilus stayed a few meters beneath the waters. According to my calculations, we had to be quite close to Suez. Through the panels in the lounge I spotted rocky bottoms lit by our electric rays. It seemed to me that the strait was getting narrower and narrower. At 9:15, when our boat returned to the surface, I climbed onto the platform. I was quite impatient to clear Captain Nemo's tunnel, couldn't sit still, and wanted to breathe the fresh night air. Soon, in the shadows, I spotted a pale signal light glimmering a mile away, half discolored by mist. "A floating lighthouse," said someone next to me. I turned and discovered the captain. "That's the floating signal light of Suez," he went on. "It won't be long before we reach the entrance to the tunnel." "It can't be very easy to enter it." "No, sir. Accordingly, I'm in the habit of staying in the pilot house and directing maneuvers myself. And now, if you'll kindly go below, Professor Aronnax, the Nautilus is about to sink beneath the waves, and it will only return to the surface after we've cleared the Arabian Tunnel." I followed Captain Nemo. The hatch closed, the ballast tanks filled with water, and the submersible sank some 10 meters down. Just as I was about to repair to my stateroom, the captain stopped me. "Professor," he said to me, "would you like to go with me to the wheelhouse?" I was afraid to ask, I replied. "Come along, then. This way, you'll learn the full story about this combination underwater and underground navigating." Captain Nemo led me to the central companionway. In mid-stair he opened a door, went along the upper gangways, and arrived at the wheelhouse, which, as you know, stands at one end of the platform. It was a cabin measuring 6 feet square and closely resembling those occupied by the helmsmen of steamboats on the Mississippi or Hudson rivers. In the center stood an upright wheel geared to rudder cables running to the Nautilus's stern. Set in the cabin's walls were 4 deadlights, windows of biconvex glass that enabled the man at the helm to see in every direction. The cabin was dark, but my eyes soon grew accustomed to its darkness, and I saw the pilot, a muscular man whose hands rested on the pegs of the wheel. Outside, the sea was brightly lit by the beacon shining behind the cabin at the other end of the platform. "Now," Captain Nemo said, "let's look for our passageway." Electric wires linked the pilot house with the engine room, and from this cabin the captain could simultaneously signal heading and speed to his Nautilus. He pressed a metal button, and at once the propeller slowed down significantly. I stared in silence at the high, sheer wall we were skirting just then, the firm base of the sandy mountains on the coast. For an hour we went along it in this fashion, staying only a few meters away. Captain Nemo never took his eyes off the 2 concentric circles of the compass hanging in the cabin. At a mere gesture from him, the helmsman would instantly change the Nautilus's heading. Standing by the port deadlight, I spotted magnificent coral substructures, zoophytes, algae, and crustaceans with enormous quivering claws that stretched forth from crevices in the rock. At 10:15, Captain Nemo himself took the helm. Dark and deep, a wide gallery opened ahead of us. The Nautilus was brazenly swallowed up. Strange rumblings were audible along our sides. It was the water of the Red Sea, hurled toward the Mediterranean by the tunnel's slope. Our engines tried to offer resistance by churning the waves with propeller in reverse, but the Nautilus went with the torrent as swift as an arrow. Along the narrow walls of this passageway, I saw only brilliant streaks, hard lines, fiery furrows, all scrawled by our speeding electric light. With my hand, I tried to curb the pounding of my heart. At 10:35, Captain Nemo left the steering wheel and turned to me. "The Mediterranean," he told me. In less than 20 minutes, swept along by the torrent, the Nautilus had just cleared the Isthmus of Suez. End of Part 2, Chapter 5.